The issue of decolonization of Russia has been brought up again since the start of the Ukrainian conflict. European countries are actively discussing it in the context of European security, having witnessed how Russia is struggling to pull off its special operation that's draining the country's resources. In this video, we'll discuss the decolonization as a process, how it can occur, and what risks are associated with it. First, let's talk about decolonization as a phenomenon in global politics. The process of decolonization is associated with the collapse of an empire and its loss of control over the colonies, followed by the formation of independent states. Currently, there are 195 different countries in the world, and at the beginning of the 20th century there were about 70. Over the past century, decolonization reached its peak and the imperial past of many countries has been left behind. This phenomenon is usually associated with the 20th century, although it can be traced back hundreds of years. For example, the American Revolution took place in the 18th century, culminating in the British Crown losing control over its colony. A major decolonization took place in the early 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars caused Spain and Portugal to lose their strongest colonies in the New World. New independent countries formed all over America. But the 20th century saw the boom of decolonization, and the world wars greatly contributed to that process. For instance, World War I ended with the collapse of 4 empires at once: the Ottoman, German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian. Some colonies became subjects of other countries. But part of these subordinate territories, especially in Europe, gained their long-awaited independence. In the years between conflicts, many empires softened their politics on colonialism. For example, in 1931 the United Kingdom issued the Statute of Westminster, which granted full legislative independence to its dominions, including Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Dominion of Newfoundland. Now part of Canada, it was then considered a separate dominion. After the Second World War, the establishment of a new world order began, and the superpowers like the USA and the Soviet Union supported smaller nations in their pursuit of independence. In 1960, UN issued a declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, although by then the process of decolonization was in full swing. Ironically, countries that were winning in armed conflicts, like Britain and France, eventually lost their positions, and with it, their former colonies. Some were let go voluntarily, like the British dominions, while others saw the outbreak of revolutions and wars of independence, like the Vietnam War, which lasted until 1975 and transcended conventional colonial warfare. All in all, by the end of the 20th century, the major colonial countries of the past had virtually lost all their territories, shrinking in size by 90% or more. However, some still own a number of overseas colonies. Typically, these are small islands in the oceans. Now let's move on to the question of decolonization of Russia itself. Over the past century, Russia also lost control of numerous territories, but retained the bulk of its land. Thus, the first collapse happened after the Revolution of 1917. Back then, certain parts of the empire, such as Poland, Finland, and the Baltic countries, broke off. However, during World War II, Stalin was able to annex part of the lands of the former Russian Empire and establish control over all of Eastern Europe. The second, more extensive process occurred with the collapse of the Soviet Union into 15 republics, which eventually became independent from Russia. But in the end, unlike Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, or Austria-Hungary, Russia was able to retain some of its historical conquests, while keeping 80% of all land, albeit many of it sparsely populated. It is worth noting that Russia still holds control over hundreds of nations and their traditional places of residence, but they do not and never had the right to become independent. There were many attempts by separatists in the 90s, but they were all suppressed rather harshly. Moreover, even the West accepted Russia's territorial integrity, so Europe and the States turned a blind eye to what was happening in Chechnya, for example. The separation of the Soviet republics was taken for granted, but if any of the autonomous regions tried to gain independence, they'd be labeled separatists. Chechnya and Tatarstan were the most striking examples of confrontations at the time. 61% of citizens supported Tatarstan's independence in a 1992 referendum, after which the authorities proclaimed independence and refused to sign a federative treaty with Russia. This lasted for 2 years, but eventually Russia and Tatarstan came to an agreement, according to which Tatarstan had extremely broad rights, and the region itself was not even called a part of Russia, but a country allied to Russia. But in the 2000s, Tatarstan practically lost all of its rights. The Chechen dispute turned into a bloody war when the Russian authorities decided to suppress the separatist region by force, wiping out everything in its path. In the end, Russia was able to consolidate control over these lands, at which point separatism in Russia all but disappeared. That is why the issue of decolonization in Russia is still relevant to this day. As mentioned previously, decolonization in the 20th century was often accompanied by wars, revolutions, and violent repressions of national movements. Nevertheless, decolonization became a mass phenomenon, and some regions have separated peacefully from their former empires. Nowadays, countries often resort to referendums for secession as well as further decolonization. Like we said before, some parts of the former empires still remain under their control. Usually, these are small islands in the oceans, but they still have the right to withdraw. For example, the largest French overseas territory, French Guiana, had a referendum in 2010 whereby the citizens refused to make the region more autonomous. In 1995, the British Bermuda held a referendum on independence, in which 74% of citizens opposed this initiative. Many such regions benefit from being part of major powers. In 2014, a more important referendum was held in Great Britain on the separation of Scotland, but 55% of residents were in favor of maintaining the status quo. Thing is, in modern Russia, this has never been possible. The question of referendums cannot even be raised in the public arena. In other words, the nations living in Russia cannot even theoretically demand independence from it, so this issue is swept under the rug. Does the West want to decolonize Russia? There is no clear answer to this question, because there is no consensus in the West on this issue. Some politicians and countries are in favor of decolonization of Russia, which would make it possible to build a new security system in Europe. Many agree that Russian imperialism can only be dismantled by decolonization. Sort of like how the Allies destroyed German Prussia, believing it to be the center of German militarism. The United States Congressional Commission even discussed a project for the decolonization of Russia, indicating the potential republics that could emerge from it. Mostly, they stem from existing national republics. On the other side of the spectrum, a lot of politicians believe Russia should stay as is, and that this could help maintain peace in Europe. Moreover, they fear that decolonization will spark armed conflicts and a massive civil war, possibly resulting in the use of nuclear weapons. Similar fears were voiced during the Soviet Union, but its collapse happened relatively peacefully. It is worth noting that a smoother decolonization is also possible without the collapse of the state, for example by transforming Russia into a confederation. Although Russia is formally a federation, it has never been one in the proper sense of the word. Since the 90s, all decisions for the regions have been made in Moscow, where the entire budget of the country is formed, and with Putin's presidency the situation has worsened. A true federation or confederation would grant more autonomy to each region, with no centralization of power or resources. This way, the nations of Russia can become more independent without losing the benefits of cooperation with other regions. Unfortunately, this option does not seem possible at the moment. The unfolding conflict and hyper-centralization of power only pushes for more violent scenarios. In conclusion, despite the separation of many territories, Russia has never undergone a full-fledged process of decolonization. Moreover, Russia doesn't allow its regions to have the right for independence. Russia's decolonization is being discussed among Western politicians, but there is no consensus on this issue. This video was made possible thanks to our sponsors on Patreon, Boosty, and YouTube. If you like our content, please consider supporting us.